We tried to persuade your daughter to go into the military. Yeah, seriously. She could use it. Oh.
Before we begin the panel discussion for the afternoon, a quick announcement for those residents of Salt Lake City that would like to pick up a flyer in the back related to the D lecture series entitled Global Justice, Poverty and War. The next lecture is Korkut Ertuk speaking on neoliberalism and globalization this coming Tuesday. And then there's somebody from the law school after that talking on March 15th. But the flyers are back there. Please pick one up and try to attend that lecture series as well. These are also... Oh, terrific. Okay, well, then I'll tout my own lecture on March 15th even further. These, I'm told, are webcast, and so you can tune in and respond also. So, thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon. This is the concluding session of our conference, and I recognize a number of people who've been with us throughout the event, and it has been a very interesting and stimulating event so far, and we hope that this last panel discussion will be an appropriate culmination of the information, the ideas that have been transmitted thus far. I wanted to remind our audience who happens to be viewing us via the internet that we welcome your emailed questions. And we would, on the website, there is a link that says Q&A available email, or the actual address for the email, if you want to email us questions from the internet, is valuesandviolence, that's AND violence, at ipia.utah.edu. And so I hope you'll join us from wherever you happen to be viewing this via podcast. I would mention that we had one email after the last session that I don't want to share with everyone, but it's for Ibrahim. It's from an H. Mubarak. And, but perhaps you can look at it.
He always manages to find me.
Yeah. It's a globalized world, even. All right. What we've tried to do with this last session is to select a few of our panelists who've given presentations throughout the preceding sessions. Also, we have Deen Chatterjee and Amos Guiora as new additions to this group to try to give us perspective on what we've learned, what can be taken away from this conference, and hopefully try to deal with some of the issues we've identified here. I know in my own mind, my ivory tower isn't that tall, and I would hope that the panelists would try to maybe lower the height of their ivory tower for this panel discussion to provide us some realistic and practical insights into the question of the implications, the policy implications of enforcement and human dignity. Does violence work, and at what cost? And so to begin this, I'm going to start in order. I'll start with Deen, and I'd like to provide each of the panelists with 3 to 5 minutes of an introduction, comments, or introduction for Amos and Deen, I guess, but maybe concluding comments, some ideas that they have synthesized from this conference and put forth those ideas in 3 to 5 minutes, and then we will open it up to the audience and to the internet for questions and answers. Deen?
I don't know what I'm going to talk in 3 to 5 minutes. Others got their share of their time, So maybe I could take maybe 4 to 5 minutes, maybe. Okay. So as I have been listening to all these most wonderful talks and thinking about policy implications vis-a-vis human dignity, human rights, and the question whether violence works and at what cost, I do see certain commonalities, certain common themes emerging from these talks. I would like to just comment on them a tiny bit and then see if I can offer something to add to that. Questions, of course, have been raised. Consistently, questions have been raised on the effectiveness of this so-called war on terrorism, war on terror, and suggestions have been made that it's time we should not call it a war. In fact, about a month and a half, 2.5 months ago, I read in the paper that the British government, Blair's government, pointedly directed all its staff in the government, in all offices, not to call this war a war on, not to call this terrorism measures a war on terror, because this application of that word, war, simply brings in more confrontation that they realized finally that is not leading anywhere, and that also brings in resentments, and it's just a wasted effort in a wrong direction. And so instead, what we have been getting here amongst the panelists, the suggestion that we should also think very seriously about this idea of cooperation, international cooperation, diplomacy, promotion of human rights, and pursuit of equitable global development. These are maybe some of the long-term ways we can have an effective way to respond to a global crisis, which could be the root causes of conflict, chaos, discontent, and of course terrorism. Now, we have been also hearing how the Bush administration have rather cunningly tried to combine the war model and the criminal justice model to give us a hybrid model, whereby it is putting the advantages of both sides and getting at the expense of the tactical disadvantages, so that they can maximize their options of operations, including perhaps torture. And of course, the net effect of that is that there's a big casualty to that, and that happens to be human rights. And the idea that, well, we are doing it all in the name of human rights, and we are on that side and they're not on that side. Now, that sounds so hypocritical and so silly when we do see that what we are doing is not only effective from a practical point of view, it is averting some of the cherished ideals of human rights that we take pride in. And that leads to another persistent theme that I have been noticing in many of these talks, which is this idea of this demonization of the other, and creating this false dichotomy. Even in fact, in our just the lecture right now, Amartya Sen talked about that too, the two faces of identity, and of course Martha Nussbaum's talk, and so many other ways we have been getting that idea that perhaps it's a clash within, and we need to resolve that right here before we project our vision and perception to the others and try to just go accordingly. Now, I wanted to comment a bit, if I had time, or perhaps I can come back later, this idea of the just war doctrine, because after all, we do have centuries-old model of morality when it comes to use of force in the context of warfare, and how we can restrain violence within a moral model with moral dimensions, and that was the just war doctrine. And questions have been raised whether that traditional model makes sense or is applicable in the context of modern warfare, where we do not have clear-cut distinction between combatants and non-combatants, where one of the criterion of the just war doctrine, the last resort, that may not make sense these days that much with the advent of WMD, especially in the hands of the terrorists and all that. Can we wait really that long? And so therefore the question of whether we could go for preemption or prevention, that's also a big issue. We know that in the just war tradition or in the international law, preventive war has not been sanctioned. Instead, it's preemption. And yet, right now, we are moving toward prevention. And that has been, in fact, the stated foreign policy imperative of the Bush doctrine that we are in a preventive warfare, and this is the war on terror, and we have a global mandate. And that is, in fact, a big concern because the Bush doctrine has, in the name of national security, has committed the military on a global obligation, on a global, what I should say, opened up the whole world based on the sole perception, internal perception of a country as to whether any and every event may eventually pose a threat, and it has to be responded based on the sole perception of the internal perception of the country right there. And that raises lots of issues, whether if other countries start following the same model, whether we are going to live really in a world safe or a chaotic world where all countries can say that, well, by the same token that we, under the name of self-defense, can commit our military on a global mission based on the internal perception of what we decide to be a threat in any part of the world. And that then leads to, and this is my last point, the question as to whether we are getting in the direction of real subversion of some of the cherished doctrines of the just war tradition. And that just war doctrine, in a rather reluctant way, went for intervention. And in general, non-interventionism is the thrust of the doctrine, and that is not there anymore. And so the question is, what type of human values do we cherish, and what is it that we are promoting in the name of fight against war, fight against terror, rather? And if it is they being the bad guy, we being the good guy, and yet we are doing anything to subvert international cooperation, international law, and basics of human rights, then what is it that we're doing? Because national security is not enhanced by our policy, and at the same time we're losing something else that's very cherished. And we are living in a global world, and it's this tribal mentality that is being promoted. And Polly Wisner gave a very interesting talk yesterday. She talked about how this tribal model could lead into warfare with certain provocations. And she talked about if we don't want to turn tribalism into terrorism, what are the ways to go about? And she came up with certain nice empirical statistics. She said that about 80% of those cases where people had a stake into something, they would go for peace and compromise and cooperation. And those 20% of those cases where they were totally marginalized, didn't have any stake into anything at all, they would go for chaos and violence. I think that's quite striking, and that shows something, which is that if we can truly promote a model of global democracy, where not only do we have democracy in individual countries, but also can go a long way in meeting that democracy deficit in the global order, so that it's a democracy of democracies, so that there is international democracy in the global order where countries have a voice, people are recognized. That may be one sure way, in a long-range, effective way, in a non-violent way, non-interventionist way, we can go for some answer to this threat of terror and conflict. And this is what I have called in my writings as preventive non-intervention. It's non-interventionist prevention. It's okay.
Could,
well, yeah,
I've got to give everyone a chance
okay,
here, please.
Very good. I'll come back. Thank you.
Thank you. Amos Guiora.
Counterterrorism law and policy, violence, does it work, and what cost in 3 to 5 minutes? That doesn't count. That's just the introduction.
I don't want to look like I'm real heavy-handed. This is the introduction to the panel. You can always go back and reiterate on your comments and expand on them later on. We've got 2 hours at least.
All right. And I have a midnight flight, so that's fine. Because I'm a lawyer, it's all about definitions. In Israel, we define this as armed conflict short of war. So we don't buy the term war on terrorism. There can be obviously no war between a state and a non-state. So the operative expression is armed conflict short of war. The next thing we need to do is to define the status of the individuals who we're fighting against. What are their rights? Because ultimately when we talk about violence and at what cost, the real question is what cost to ourselves. Because if you truly believe in balance between the rights, balancing the rights of the individual against the rights of the state, that ultimately is what counterterrorism, if you do it successfully, is all about. There are three operative paradigms in which we can define how to go about trying to suspected terrorists. One is the criminal law paradigm, to treat them as criminals. Two is, are they POWs? Or three is there a hybrid paradigm, which is a little bit of this and a little bit of that. I argue that the only way we can really bring these people to justice, and we need to bring them to justice in a fair and judicial system, is by developing a hybrid where you give them some rights but not all rights. But what is important at all times is to make sure that we do respect the rights of the detainees. Where we failed to date, I think if we go 9/11 till now, here's what we've seen. That there has been in large part an unfettered executive with widespread executive powers, and from the perspective of individual liberties and guaranteeing the rights of the detainees, I think we've failed. We failed for a number of for three specific reasons. One, because the executive this particular executive has really believed in widespread powers. He has been helped by a very acquiescent Supreme Court. It was only this summer that in Hamdan, the first time the Supreme Court really ruled against this executive. And frankly, there's been also a very acquiescing Congress. If there is no congressional oversight and if there's no active judicial review, then we are guaranteed to continue the way we were going through the past 6 years. So when we talk about violence and at what cost, what I would emphasize here in terms of what we've heard the past 2 days is looking at ourselves. How have we truly conducted, or have we truly conducted counterterrorism according to the rule of law? If we have not conducted counterterrorism according to the rule of law, then at the end of the day we've conducted ourselves immorally and we are unable to look at ourselves in the mirror. Bruce mentioned yesterday not only this generation but the next generation and the generation thereafter. If we are unable to look at ourselves in the mirror, our children can't look at us. And if our children can't look at us, then we are not ever going to successfully conduct what I call successful operational counterterrorism, which requires doing two things simultaneously. One, what Bruce calls kinetics, right? Very polite expression for killing the bad guys. And two, far more complicated than that, we must reinvest both educationally and financially in places like South Asia, call it Radio-Free South Asia, Radio-Free Middle East, an enormous investment by the United States. Otherwise, we will not make significant gains against terrorism. You cannot win the war, so-called war on terrorism. I think the best you can do is marginalize it, but marginalizing means, one, killing the bad guys, and two, reinvesting, and all under the umbrella of the rule of law and conducting yourselves morally. Thank you.
3 to 5 minutes. It's the past the 3 that more they. Let me address actually what was in the program and see. Microphone, please. Maybe I will have to. Here, Bruce. This one's working. No. Okay, is this better? Yep, good. Okay. Let me, unfortunately, I've eaten up 20 seconds. Let me, though, address first the topic that was in the brochure, does violence work and at what cost, and then put that in the context of this conference. The does violence work, I think, is a no-brainer. I mean, of course it does. I mean, this is why we're at this conference. I mean, indisputably, violence works, at least at a tactical level. That's precisely why individuals are attracted to terrorism, because they see that it works. I mean, terrorism doesn't occur in a vacuum. It occurs and it's imitated and it multiplies precisely because the perpetrators feel that they can gain from it. And I think this is clear in the amount of publicity and attention that is focused on terrorism, the fear and anxiety that terrorists undeniably are able to generate, the responses in some instances or in many instances or in most instances that are counterproductive that they seek to elicit from governments. So I think that part of the question, certainly the past 2 days of the conference have shown us, given the range of conflicts, the range of geographies that have been discussed, and I think one of the benefits of this conference as well is that we didn't remain completely fixated on Al-Qaeda or on the Middle East, and that we had some very rich and interesting presentations on other regions as well. But that's one issue, is firstly to recognize that despite what politicians say, despite what many people say that terrorism doesn't work, I mean, it does. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this enormous problem of terrorism. And parenthetically, This was exactly what attracted me to this field literally 30 years ago, the first year I was in graduate school, because politicians everywhere were saying that terrorism doesn't work, terrorism never succeeds, and yet I remember, to my astonishment, the power, for example, that the Palestine Liberation Organization and the influence that it was able to achieve in the years following the Munich Olympic incident, so that by the end of the 1970s, the PLO, a non-state actor, had diplomatic relations with more countries than Israel, the established nation state, did. So terrorism works and terrorism succeeds. That we should accept. What we can accept, and what I think the crux of this conference is that if terrorism works tactically, and if it's been successful in bringing the terrorists their tactical objectives, what can we do? How can we work? Why do we have to work ceasingly, without respite, to ensure that terrorism never works strategically? And I think there, on that side of the coin, despite the violence that we've seen not just in the past, the first 6 years of this century, but certainly during the latter 25 years of the second century, undeniably we see that despite the rise in terrorism, despite its proliferation, despite its escalating lethality, terrorists, except for scaring us, except for causing us to divert large sums of money to security, I mean, strategically, on their point of view, it has not succeeded. And I think that's the goal that we should never lose sight of. Now, how do we prevent terrorism from not succeeding strategically? I mean, first and foremost was something actually in the article that Martha referred to this morning by David from Foreign Affairs in 1975. I mean, it was exactly right when he said that terrorism works and has its effect only when you allow it to work and has that effect. And that's why I think forums like this and other ones are so important, because they help us to begin to map out, because strategic questions by definitions are big questions or big issues, and they have to, their discussion and their airing, their polishing and their honing has to start somewhere. And the universities, I think, because of the exchange of ideas, the lack of political agendas at conferences like this and elsewhere, are precisely the right testing ground for these strategies to be discussed, to be debated, to be honed, to be sharpened, and then to make their way to the policymakers. And you could see, at least in the three broad areas of this conference, why what I'm saying is not only not hyperbole, but why these types of forums are so important. Firstly, if you're going to prevent something strategically from occurring, this goes a little bit to what I was saying yesterday, you have to understand why it occurs. And this, I think, as I mentioned yesterday, is one of the great failings in the war on terrorism, is we have never paused in our impatience, in, I think, our own hubris as the world's remaining superpower. We really haven't paused and taken the time and devoted the resources and efforts to achieving that understanding. And at least a concatenation of activities such as this one and endeavors like this one can contribute to that enormously. And just in the past, it's not even 2 days, in the past day and a half, we heard how utterly idiosyncratic, how complex, and how diverse the causes of terrorism are, from demographic matters that George and Richard talked about, to ones that deal with psychologies from childhood, to Martha Nussbaum's talk yesterday about the fusion of right-wing nationalism with a religious veneer. So what we know is that the causes, indisputable, are diverse. In many cases, they're amorphous. But this deserves serious academic and empirical study, not something that's based on conjecture or that views the problem through our own prisms. Once we understand the causes, then we can begin to identify and understand the range of possible options, which is what I see both the center here at the university and certainly a conference like this as beginning to do, and finally to identify what needs to be done. So that's the does violence work? What about at what cost? Well, a lot of the discussion at this conference, too, I think very clearly has shown what some of the costs are. And the costs, lamentably, in recent years, they seem almost to be less to the terrorists and more to ourselves, our place in the world, the way that we're regarded and respected, and in fact, even some of the challenges to our own cherished values that unfortunately have, if not been watered down, but in other instances have been pushed aside because of the war, this war on terrorism. And that's the biggest cost. I mean, we have to remember that the goal of terrorism throughout the ages has always been at least twofold. First, to generate profound fear and anxiety that the terrorists hope will lead to not just paranoia, but also xenophobia. That what they are trying to do fundamentally is rent the fabric of trust that holds society together. that they're trying to get us to turn against our fellow citizens. They're trying to make us a suspicious, seething, besieged mass. And I go back to David Fromm's point. That it succeeds only when we let it happen. But I think it also succeeds when our political leaders aren't honest with us, when the discussions are always about magically, hermetically sealing off the United States from terrorist attack. When we also, as a public, look to the 9/11 Commission to tell us what went wrong, then to tell us how to fix it, and then look to our leaders to fix it under the belief that terrorism is never again going to occur. And we're right now, I think, in a very dangerous position in the United States, in that we've allowed our sense of well-being and our sense of security to become completely bound up with terrorism. And I worry profoundly that in the event of a terrorist attack in this country, something along the lines of what I was talking about yesterday, not another, God forbid, 9/11, but something like the 7/7/05 attacks. You know, we have to thank our lucky stars each day that we don't have attacks on our subways or the metros. But what would be the reaction in the United States? How would we respond to that, especially after our government has spent billions of dollars? We've gone on one war that was of our choice, another war that wasn't necessarily of our choice to defeat this threat. Goes back
Bruce.
to the points. Oh, so am I exceeding the 5? Oh gosh, okay. Sorry about that. I didn't realize. Well, that's the problem.
Terrible here, but
That's the problem with being unscripted. Okay.
I set the standard. So
Right. Okay. So, I mean, these are the questions that we have to ask, and this was something that I think was riven throughout the 2 days proceedings about some of the detrimental nature of a war. Now let me say one thing and I will stop. Everybody reads columnists. I think if one's more intellectual, you read Tom Friedman or David Ignatius or Jim Hoagland. My favorite is Maureen Dowd, and it always has been, because she skewers everyone. And the other day she said something that I actually wrote down. It's not even that I often write things down, but it's very appropriate. And I will stop right after this quote. The other day she wrote something, the Ozone Man sequel, I think it was in Tuesday's column, it was about, as she referred to him, the Goracle, Al Gore appearing at the Oscars. And she wrote, and I think this is sort of the epitaph of our era, and I'm quoting her, "Instead of aiming for the stars, the greatest power on earth is bogged down in poorly navigated conflicts against ancient tribes and brutes in caves." And that's, I think, what part of what we've been talking about has gotten to. I mean, we recoil, I think rightly, we take tremendous chagrin that there's a large swath of people throughout the world that look at us, that we see ourselves as fighting the brutes in caves, but there's a lot of people in the world that because of our deportment, but because of what we've done in the war on terrorism, they've started to equate us with the brutes in caves as well, and that's precisely what we have to reverse. So, thank you. I'll stop.
Ibrahim, you're up.
Oh. I was thinking about H. Mubarak.
About you.
I think in response, by now it is clear in response, in my mind at least, that the question of whether terrorism works it depends on works in what. If it works in gaining attention and making the case of a certain cause more present in the public space, the answer is yes. But in most cases I know of this kind of research, it has to be followed by a political platform. Even when we were talking about the PLO attracting this, if there is no political platform, then the outcome will not be something that we can characterize as working. And even with a political platform, it didn't go very well. So I'm just saying the idea of constant military confrontation on their part against regimes that are much more equipped and supported by outside powers as well is not in the cards. And they realize that. So they would be surprised about our unqualified assessment that things have been working well for them. And in fact, Muntasir al-Zayat and others who wrote about al-Harakat al-Islamiyya, Ru'ya min al-Dakhil, these Islamic groups look from within, refer to debates within the ranks that suggest that we got the attention, but we are stuck in prisons for 20 years, and this kind of thing. The second thing that I want to say is, in many cases we are obsessed with one-liner question, like why do they hate us so much? And from day one, I wasn't impressed with that question. I wasn't impressed with it because I think there is a more intelligent question and more important question, which is tied to the logic of cumulative provocation that I talked about before, and I assume you all memorize the expressions used in that glorious thing, is that they are, is that the more important question is, what do they want us to do so that we don't do it? Not why do they. Any superpower must have some people who hate it. Those who don't want, to have anybody hating them, they should resign from power politics, in a way. I'm just saying this is part of the things that come. It doesn't have to be a brutal suppression, but what I'm saying is, you should not be shocked that some people would hate you, because the reasons behind that are quite multiple. I think it's important to have an analysis of what makes him tick, so to speak, and I'm in agreement with Bruce in that regard, but especially the issue of the logic of time. The logic of time, something discussed by so many, including David C. Rappaport, is that you have the militants saying that the danger is looming around the corner from within and from without, the 5 minutes to midnight image, and the Muslim Brotherhood types would say, why are you saying this? Why are you so upset? Things are working for us. People are overflowing from mosques behind it. Nasser in Egypt, the Shah of Iran in Iran, obviously. The Bourguiba in Tunisia and Ataturk in Turkey, all of them had positions against religious influences in politics and all of that. Where are they now? If we succeeded in these cases, why are you getting so excited? Why are you getting so hyper? Why are you allowing the regimes to strike back at all of us, the moderates and militants? So the logic of type, but it follows from that political Islamists should be allowed to function within the boundaries of political system legitimately, and if President Mubarak is listening, as a matter of fact, I would suggest to him that there is no alternative, but realistically, but to do that. Now, the fourth thing that I want to say is that these regimes understand America much better than America understands them. Very much better, than this. So, Mubarak's case, when things are not going very well and Islamic fundamentalists are rising and so on, America is talking about democratization. He does two things. One, he starts joint maneuvers under exotic titles like Bright Star and Sea Breeze and all of that with the United States. That's what he does. And then he suddenly has an agreement about natural gas thing with Israel after having no ambassador in Israel for a long time. You know why? Because he believes that this country is a one-cause country. One cause, one issue. He thinks that if he improves relations with Israel, then all the critical senators and congressmen will change their position. Whether he's right or wrong, that's a different story. But that is the perception that we have. One last pessimistic note. I expect things to get worse as a result of the Iraq situation. Not only because of the sense of indignation about it, but also because there is a pattern. The returnees, as we call it, al-aiduna in Arabic, the returnees from Chechnya, and before that the returnees from Afghanistan, brought a different skill structure than the one that would have. The other one would require walking to the place. After you go to Pakistan, you have remote control bombing, of a certain kind. The ones who are coming from Iraq are likely to add and to elevate the skill structure of these groups, and then we will have another round of worsening of the process. Thank you.
Is this mic on? Can you all hear me? It's on? Okay, great. Well, since I don't have very much time, what I'll have to do is assign all of you to do some reading. And I would encourage you to read the National Security Strategy of the United States and the National Security Strategy for Combating Terrorism. First version of these documents came out in 2002 and 2003, and then in 2006, the U.S. government issued a new version of each of the documents. And they also issued two other interesting documents. One, a National Military Strategy for Combating Terrorism, Interesting, isn't it? Not a national political strategy for combating terrorism, a military strategy for combating terrorism in DOD. And then in September, the White House issued a little progress report or report card for themselves as to how they were doing in the war on terrorism. All these are available on the web. I've done a fairly detailed study of these documents, and I'll just single out a couple of things about them that would be relevant to us. One is all of our detailed discussions and debates over what is causing terrorism, what's going on, the effect of Iraq. You're not going to see much awareness at all in these documents of all of these nuances and complicated factors that we've brought out in our discussions. It really is a dismaying read along those lines. There's an improvement between the first version and the second version of the national security strategies in that there's a softening of the unilateralist edge, and they don't talk so much anymore about preemption, which is good. But otherwise, I think there's also a lack of awareness of the damage that American actions have done to any kind of combat against terrorism. For example, they talk about the war in Iraq, and they describe it as having been twisted by extremists into some sort of propaganda tool, as though there were no reality there that people might genuinely be offended by. And similarly, with anything else like that that people might object to, well, that's just something that they twist into a propaganda cry. There's an almost complete lack of just a blindness toward the failure, really, to democratize the Middle East. The first version, of course, of the national security strategies calls for preemption against all threats. The second one says that the cure for all terrorism is democratization. It never even speaks to the fact that how can you spread democracy? Actually, at the point of a gun, does this really work? These are extraordinary documents, and I would urge you to read them. The progress report, the kind of report card that came out in September of last year, similarly, it admits that some things are not going too well, but it says democracy is on the march in the Middle East. That countries like Tunisia, that now democratic elections have become the norm in Middle Eastern countries. And you'd wonder, what on earth is the source for this particular piece of information? It's simply, there are a number of other statements like this that are just offered as broad statements of what's happening. So I would urge you to read all those documents and make your own judgment about whether or not the assessment that's contained in these documents, which is the consensus view of the U.S. government, I take them much more seriously than I do speeches by the president, the vice president, the Rumsfeld. These are consensus documents coming out of the National Security Council, and I think some of the early versions were written by some fairly important players, and they really are a very, sadly, enlightening read about the kind of the realism. The president said that our goals are idealistic and the means are realistic, but the appreciation of reality in these documents, I would argue, is not very realistic.
Well, Bruce invoked the image of Maureen Dowd, and I appreciate Maureen certainly, but I'm from Texas, and so I want to take a few moments to respect the memory of Molly Ivins, who not only could skewer people, but make us laugh wholeheartedly while she was doing it. And I remember about a week after her death, one of the columnists in the Times took a whole series of Molly Ivins quotes from 2002 and sort of stacked them up, wondering why this non-expert from Texas could figure out that war on terror and invasion of Iraq have little to do with each other or with the reality that we are facing. So I have to just kind of invoke that memory for a moment. I took the title of this afternoon's panel a little differently than I took it to be the question of, does violence by the state against terrorists work? Does counter-violence work? And I have to say, well, the whole point of a state is that the state is supposed to have the monopoly on the legitimate use of force. Now, I use force there, not violence. But necessarily, when you have the monopoly on the legitimate use of force, that occasionally will mean violence. You will have to use violent force on occasion to carry out the mandate of your society. what makes me very sad, really, is to think back to late 2001 and early 2002 and to realize that the United States had by far the most credibility, the most power of any nation or empire, I think, in the history of the world, that we had the opportunity at that moment to really reshape the way we go about interacting with other nations and with large groups of people, be they nations or non-states. And that credibility, that power has just been squandered. We don't have that credibility even really among our own allies at this point. We don't have it within our own borders at this point. The references throughout this conference to the conflicts within, I think, have to be taken extremely seriously for ourselves as well as for the groups with which we want to deal. And that does make me think about, again, Akil Bilgrami's point that 90% of any group is going to reject the violent tendencies of the 10%. But if you have to use violence against the 10%, and maybe it's not 10% that you have to use violence, maybe there's only one or two ringleaders against whom you have to use violence. The trick is to somehow appeal to the rest of that group in a way that does not tip them over into a violent response. Does violence beget violence beget violence? It certainly can. It certainly can. And so we hear a lot about this question of how do you appeal to the hearts and minds of a group of others. And I appreciate both Martha Nussbaum and Mark Yacin's references to the identity of people that identify themselves in various levels. So if we're going to appeal to both the identity as a group of others from us, but also an identity as part of a global citizenry, then we really have to be thinking about the question of how does a state organize itself to give credence to all the various identities within it. And we've now got very diverse states, and we have quite homogeneous states, and trying to figure out how they can all interact within a globalized community with coherent political structures, not identical, but coherent political structures, I think has yet to really be accomplished. I really think we need a lot of new work. And Ben, I was looking at with interest at the ideas of the political economics needing to be rethought. And I would hope that we're going to really look at some new ways of organizing political structures that will take account of differences among these cultural groups. And that's, again, I come full circle back to Bruce. I applaud the interdisciplinary character of these conversations. We really need the political scientists talking to the engineers, talking to the health care workers. Everybody has got to figure out how we're going to deal with multiple cultures in coherent political systems. And I think that's a very important part of this.
All right, thank you all. Yes, Deen?
George, can I just make only one or two comments? Because Wayne and I, we have been doing a paper together, never got a chance to present it together because of change of program. But now that Wayne ended with something, I would like to add something to it so that it shows where we have been together.
That's fine. I've been told that since we have a good turnout today and people on the internet, that we want to provide plenty of time to address questions and then a few minutes for you to sum up as we'll do the same thing. So if you can do it in a couple of minutes, that would be fine.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This was not part of any deliberate Arab-Israeli related thing.
That's why you get those
No, it was under the chair, in fact. It is a structural problem.
Does it work now? It doesn't work now.
Yeah, you go.
Okay. Wayne and I, we have been talking, discussing this prospect or this idea of a global civil society, and that idea, of course, is the idea of a network of cooperation, diplomacy, and fostering of democracy in a non-violent way through proactive means rather than in a reactive manner where we think more of force than of some forward-looking non-violent measures to diffuse problems. And this idea of a global civil society, that's it, yeah. This idea...
Spider in the web?
Okay, very good. That makes sense. Okay. I talked a bit about this doctrine of preventive non-intervention, and how does that relate to this idea of global civil society? Let me read only 2 sentences here. Unlike the principled anti-interventionist arguments of the pacifists, the idea of a global civil society based on cooperation and democratic values sketched just now is anti-interventionist in a contingent sense. It's not necessarily against intervention per se, as for instance where intervention is the only option for preemptive reasons, but against the way it's taking place in the name of war on terror, or against its feasibility in a complicated and interdependent world. In that context, this idea that I just mentioned, which is that we live in a global world today, and yet there is a tribal mindset going on because of the policies of our leaders. It's us versus them, and this tribalism turns into terrorism. On the domestic front, too, there is a politics of terror, which is our administration is putting forth to keep us in perpetual fear for political gain. I think that sounds very close to a definition of terrorism. And so how could we fight terrorism by means of terrorism? I don't quite understand that. Anyway.
Thank you very much, Richard. What I'd like to do is to lay out a couple of ground rules, is that I will go around and you need to have a mic so that the people on the internet can hear, so please wait with your question for your mic. And if you wouldn't mind, give your name, and then if you don't want to give your name, that's fine too, but give a question. I would prefer concise questions as opposed to polemic statements, and give a question and allow our experts to respond to that. All right? Let's see. Someone who's way in the back there. Richard, I'll make you hike a little bit. Is there an internet question? All right. You need to take the mic. Oh, you need to come out this way because of the feedback from the speakers.
I want to ask the panel. I came to the talks yesterday and today.
Is the mic on?
Is this on?
They assured me they were working. But
I came to both talks last night and
right here.
today. I talked with my hands a lot.
Well.
And the speakers last night and today, none of them mentioned the plight of the Palestinian people, and no mention of how they've sowed the seeds of violence in the Middle East. However, this distinguished panel here did not miss an opportunity to mention the PLO and the Palestine Liberation Organization and how they achieved renown in the world. However, in '67...
Could you give us a question, please?
I'm giving you it.
Okay.
In '67, when Israel invaded Palestine and displaced all these Palestinians, and then the Palestinians needed to get recognized somehow because the rest of the world wasn't doing anything about it. So they went to Munich and did their thing, and they got the recognition that they were looking for, I guess, with the Israeli lobby at work. However, when Ehud Barak came here last week, his underlying theme was kill, kill, and kill some more. And I want to ask the panel, how do they think that will sow the seeds of love? Do they think the killing is sending roses out to the Palestinians in the Arab world? Or are they trying to foster more violence to just single out the Palestinian population and the Lebanese population? Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you. And your question does approach the issue that we presented the panel of, does violence work for counterterrorism? It does work for terrorism. Does it work for countering terrorism as well? Someone on the panel want to take a shot at this, particularly pertaining to Palestine? Amos hasn't. Amos, you haven't done much work the last couple of days. I think you need.
I should begin in the name of full disclosure that I spent the past 20 years of my life in the Israel Defense Forces. I was doing counterterrorism day in, day out. That's in the name of full disclosure. In the various counterterrorism measures that we undertook, and I'm not here as anybody's spokesman, I barely represent my wife. It is counterterrorism, if you want to do it effectively, very much requires a yin and a yang. Go back to what I said earlier. It has to be according to the rule of law. It has to be done morally. You also have to try to do it effectively. But it divides into two streams. Stream number one is, frankly, killing those before they kill you. Provided you have reliable and corroborated intelligence information, the only way to prevent an act of terrorism is to kill them. In addition to that, simultaneous to that, there's no doubt that one needs to try to engage in some kind of a peace process. There's no doubt that one needs to reach out in terms of education. There's no doubt that one needs to make economic opportunities available. They are not mutually exclusive. I don't know what Barak said last week, but from my perspective, the two are combined. It's extremely difficult to do it. It's very difficult to do it when you are under the gun, having been involved in the peace process for 5 years. That being said, the only way to go forward is ultimately through the peace process. That being said, operational counterterrorism requires you to protect yourself, and ultimately what the nation's leaders must do is protect the citizenry. It works on a two-tier basis. Is it difficult? It's extremely difficult. Is it possible? I think so. I don't think any nation does it perfectly. I think also if we're going to talk about Israel and the Palestinians, one can never also forget the whole role of Palestinian terrorism in this. But that being said.
I want to say 2 points. One is that I'm absolutely certain that there is no military solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict. None whatsoever. On the Palestinian side, on the Israeli side, and on both sides, there were some who were delusional enough to think that this is attainable. It is not doable. But I think we will be delusional in this setting if we entertain the proposition that a meaningful discussion could happen here about the selective reading of history that the parties tend to engage in. I remember I was asked by Richard Dreyfuss a number of years ago to participate in a HBO program about how does a conflict, a settlement conference would look like about that for Lorimar Pictures. And it was clear that people who are equally well versed in studying the topic reach fundamentally different conclusions about what happened. One of them, I can say it was, on the Israeli side, said that you blew it. You had an opportunity to reach an agreement in 1947 with the partition resolution. You insisted on everything being taken. The other one on the Palestinian side said, remember 1904? When we wanted to live with you and you speak our language and you employ our workers instead of paying money by the hostage route to the workers from East Europe who were more expensive than we can. I think to do justice to this conference, directing energies in that direction now, when most of the Palestinians and most of the Israelis want to have a settlement, will be a step back rather than a step forward.
There is an internet. Is this one working?
This one works.
This one?
glad.
Yeah, come to the mic. Come to the mic and read it, please.
This is from H. Mubarak. No, this is not the H. Mubarak. I put that one on hold. This one is from someone in Bangkok, Thailand. It says that much blame for the current state of the war on terror has been attributed by the participants to Bush administration policy and rhetoric, which certainly does deserve much of the blame. But doesn't the U.S. domestic political climate and the blame game between liberals and conservatives, blaming each other for both past and potential future terrorist actions, also distract people from truly understanding the terrorist threat and what should be done about it? How can this problem be addressed?
Come on, we need 3 men and women here.
Well, I think a very interesting question is the long-term consequences of counter-terrorist policies, particularly in liberal democracies, and that's something I'm actually working on at the moment. And you see not just in the United States, but in some other liberal democracies, the way in which the debate over how to deal with terrorism has been enormously divisive, with usually the party in power that supports strong measures dismissing any criticism of those measures as unpatriotic. And we see this, you've seen this in Canada, you've seen there's a lot of partisan divide, you've seen some of this in Germany. I don't have a good solution for how to get over that other than that we, the public, enter the debate in a reasoned sort of way, and that we don't vote for people who politicize this sort of debate and make it into a partisan kind of debate. I mean, we can vote, we can agitate, we can write our representatives, we can say we don't like this kind of politics. So I would say it's up to us.
Actually, I like that question for a slightly different reason. A very wise psychologist, I remember, once said to me that the only use of guilt is to remind yourself of what you don't want to do anymore. And I think you can say the same thing about blame, that we study the past only for the purpose of going forward. And no, blaming is not helpful, but you do need to figure out what you've done wrong in the past in order to make the future better. So the reason we look backwards is only to guide our forward steps, and that's where I think all of us are trying to push, is forward.
My take on that question is that in a way the terrorists are succeeding in achieving their goal vis-a-vis us by making us a divisive society where democracy is being subverted right now, because there cannot be a thriving democracy without a thriving platform of public reason, where people can express their ideas, and that's precisely where we are being shortchanged, because unless it's the administration line, we are being told that we're not patriotic. And that is the big danger for democracy, and in that sense, that's a victory for the terrorists.
Well, it appears that our audio component and our audio backup is letting us down here. And since we're trying to get this over the podcast, what I'm going to have to ask is, for those of you who have questions, are actually going to have to walk up here, and I would appreciate if you would come up here, ask your question, and then go back and the panel will answer it. And we'll have to do it that way. I'd like to start out. Our man, the audio man, is working on this feverishly, and hopefully we'll get something that's portable here. But sorry, but we'll just. Well, I don't know.
This is a question about that presupposes that there are at least two kinds of terrorist projects. One is what you might call secessionist or separatist terrorism, where the effort is to try to, for a group to try to get out from under the domination of a majority which mistreats it. And the other is exclusionary, or you might call it ejective terrorism, where the effort is to try to get rid of an infiltrating, what's perceived as an infiltrating group. This question only relates to the first one. It's sometime, and the question is, do you think this would work, or could it work, and if so, why don't we do it? Would it be possible to so revise world court procedures or develop some kind of world court that was empowered to hear cases, not just from governments, as is currently the case, but from separatist entities within states about the merits or lack of merit of their cases? Be a little bit like divorce cases, you know, that we hear in other courts, where the world as a whole, so to speak, reflects on the merit or lack of merit of a separatist case, and that group thus doesn't need to resort to violence to make its case. So, would it work?
I think that sounds a little like a question addressed to a lawyer, I'm sorry to say. So,
Yes, doesn't it? It might be, why isn't there such a court?
Yeah, well, I think the answer as to why there isn't is fairly easy. The question of whether there could be is much harder. Why there isn't is because the group seeking separatist status does not have recognition as an entity.
That's just the point, right.
Right. So how do you say that there is an entity to bring the proceeding and to make their legal arguments? Now, could there be? That really does require a rather radical rethinking of the idea of territorial sovereignty. And my colleague Tony Ange's book, I think, does a very good job of showing that territorial sovereignty, having been the basis for the rules by which nation states interact, will have to yield to some more nuanced version of group identity in the future, but we're not there yet. And it'll take a while before we can get to an idea of group identity. In a global federalism, it could happen, yes, it could happen. But we're really radically rethinking the idea of nation states versus group identity when we do that.
Anyone else want to jump in with this? All right, but thank you for the question, and I appreciate the question orientation of what, rather than wringing our hands over the issue as it is, that question implied what are possible solutions and suggestions for solutions, and I'd like to see more of that, the International Justice Court and some of the activities there, if that's a viable option. So I'm going to go back and forth. If there's someone on this side, sure. I'm trying to pick new faces. I've been told, does this work?
Yes.
It does work.
University of Utah student Jason Lee, and I have a question to assess the astuteness of our panel here concerning war. I would like to know, is there anything uglier than war? It's a question I have, and I'd like an answer.
Well, I'd say it depends on the war, but I would say a march of sin might point you to famine, other causes of disease, misery, death, and suffering, and wars are among them. So I would say that wars are not the only cause of human suffering, although they are a major one. And yes, the prospect of people deliberately killing each other, even the wars in Papua New Guinea, there may be nothing worse than people murdering each other for a political cause, but there are many other causes of distress. And the people who use terrorism have at times in the past justified it in terms of suffering caused by things like sanctions imposed on Iraq and the number of children who died, not in war, but as the consequences of, in effect, economic policies. So it's a very mixed sort of question.
I would also point out, and I can't help butting in on this, that there are rules of warfare that, by the law of armed conflict, attempt to keep war as such, as a legal juristic concept, in as restrained a fashion as one can make it while still killing. And the reason for that is there are things uglier than just killing. There are torture, there are dehumanizing, there are mutilation of people, there are things people do to each other in genocidal settings that are much worse than the more or less restrained conflicts of formal warfare. And it's important to realize that, because a war fought with the full panoply of protections is not what most people see when they see military and non-military units lining up against each other.
Thank you. This has been a wonderful conference. I want to thank you all. A major theme to have come out of a number of presentations and a lot of discussion is the question of identity. And I think some very interesting comments have been made about identity on all levels. Amartya Sen used the phrase, the illusion of choicelessness, which I thought was very interesting, to talk about unitary identities and how they can appear fixed, monolithic, unchanging, and of course that can lead to social solidarity internally in a group, but it can also lead to hostility toward an outgroup. But I think identity is not always easy to reason through, and I wonder if we don't shortchange the emotional dimensions of identity when we talk about it in some of these ways. Let me give you a very benign example very quickly. In universities like this one, development offices count on people, even 50 years after their graduation, identifying very strongly with the institution, even though the institution at that point bears practically no resemblance to the place that they attended, right? But we count on that. And in other domains, we see the same sort of thing, but often with life and death consequences. Although some people treat their loyalties to institutions that way too, right? And so my question is this. I mean, considering the American citizenry in particular, the citizenry of the United States, and the compelling nature of some of the narratives that keep resurfacing, good guys and bad guys, appeals to Western frontier notions, all the various ways that we do in-group and out-group in the world, searching for enemies and so forth. In any sphere, the legal sphere, policy-making sphere, the media, education, and in other domains, what practical strategies would any of you recommend for, let's say, inviting people to unsettle those unitary identities that they so easily fall into because they are so compelling and sometimes even exhilarating?
I'm not from here, so.
You're not one of us?
No. I need any suggestions on this? Sure, Dean.
This whole idea of a vibrant democracy, the idea of a vibrant democracy and to promote democracy globally, which I call international, international, meaning a democracy of democracies may be a way to do it, because democracy, a vibrant democracy is an experiment in pluralism. And that is one way to shed our monolithic conception of identity and try to embrace a multifaceted identity and make it possible for others to go in that direction as well. And the thing is that from George's question, the suggestion I got is that perhaps we have to do it on a personal basis as well, which is fine. But I think when it's a project this way, it has to be institutional. And there I don't see any other alternative than the idea of promoting democracy.
Despite the fact that I'm not from here, I want to register. I appreciate the research on identity and so on. It's definitely much more developed and much more mature than other sometimes structural kind of explanations that see everything happening because of a complete absence of alternatives. But I have two dissenting points about it. One is that, and especially in the case of America, one is that when you say that there is multiple identities, and each one of them is elastic, then the arrows will go in 15 directions, and any claim of a direct linkage between any of those, because you don't know which one is operative under certain times. Sometimes it becomes the analyst's judgment of the things rather than the community under discussion itself. You know, I'm not sure. And the other dissenting view that I have, that in migrant societies, already there is an element of, multiplicity of identities, so that it becomes even more complex. There are multiple identities, each of them is elastic due to cultural and ethnic differences, and you don't know what segment of the population are you talking about. And hence I think there would be a need for some degree of, specific nature of the discussion somewhat, rather than that level of generalization.
Professor Belgrami? It's not working?
Yeah, I think it is, Richard. Speaking to it. Hello? No.
How about this one?
You know, it's quite right to point out that there are multiple identities, but I said it's quite right to point out there are multiple identities, but the fact is that the identity is a problem only because one of these multiple identities tends to loom large in certain contexts which abide for a very long time, given certain sort of historical situations. So to appeal to multiple identities is a way of dissolving really serious problems that we encounter can't possibly be right. I mean, so I have lots of identities. I'm a father, I'm a professor, I'm a philosopher, and so on. But it may be that under certain circumstances, my being an Indian matters much more than these others, and it matters for a very long time because the problems which give rise to the identity abide for a very long time. So yes, of course there are multiple identities, but the problem is when the multiple identities actually one abstracts away from a lot of them to stress one, and then you have to diagnose why it is that one gets stressed much more than the others. And there's no doubt, as one of you just asked, George Cheney asked the question about emotions being a very important part of identity. And you know, one of the things that has been stressed through this conference is that, including by things I said, but what Amartya said and Martha said, is that a lot of identity comes from a feeling of helplessness and defeat and victimization. This is very well known. We've talked about it at length over 2 days. But I also wanted to just stress that some feelings of identity emerge not out of defeat, but out of triumphalism. That is, I mean, the examples is, you take the Scots. The Scots began to feel British once the British Empire became a real thing. And the Scots began to feel that, well, now we are British after all. Irving Howe talks very interestingly of how a lot of people in 1967 felt a sense of Jewish identity, even though they'd forgotten about the Holocaust, but then a certain sort of sense of triumph in 67 sort of made them feel suddenly as it. So it can come out of triumphalism, it can come out of defeat. They're complicated things. One has to study each one of them in particular contexts. And one of the things that I wanted to ask about the question of emotions, because Deen raised it, it's a very widespread view, is that American citizens, apparently, according to the standard diagnosis, their fear is appealed to in, first of all, justifying the wars on terror, and secondly, to put aside basic civil liberties. That constantly the appeal is to fear against terrorism. But I just want to ask, no doubt that is true, but maybe there ought to be some research, perhaps through polls or some empirical research, on whether how much of it is due to fear and how much, my informal sense from looking at listening to radio shows, looking at the results of polls, is that just as much as fear, the emotion is, how dare they do this to us? Right? It's a sense of sort of feeling vulnerable and feeling outraged by the fact that a country which has always been powerful should be made to feel vulnerable. And that's just as strong an emotion that was prompted by September 11th. Immediately after it was fear, but after the first few months, this emotion seems to me to be just as strong in the way people responded. And I'd just be very curious to understand how much of it is fear and how much of it is this other sense of...
Amos, you feel qualified to parse this fear and emotions?
I feel qualified to... Doesn't work, I don't feel qualified. I feel qualified to answer a small part of a wonderful question. When we talk about fear, when I examine this as a legal academic, the first thing that I do is to examine the role of the Supreme Court and how has the Supreme Court protected the rights of those who are potentially under attack. And so if you view the history of the United States Supreme Court when this nation is under attack, because we are in the business of giving grades, this is not on the web, the grade is very low. Because if you view Hamdan, I said earlier, the first time in 2006 the Supreme Court held against the executive. But if you go back and trace this in American history, Korematsu, World War II, is the Supreme Court at its very worst. Also in the aftermath of World War I, there were also a couple of cases there where we clearly saw the Supreme Court acquiescing with the executive who felt emboldened, felt the need to respond to public pressure because of this issue of fear. So when we view fear as lawyers, what we really do need to ask ourselves is what institution, be it the Congress, the executive, or the court, is protecting the rights of those who are under attack. And I think in terms of fear, the public wants to see, pardon the expression, wants to see blood, wants to see something. I think the Supreme Court here needs to play a critical role. I think to date, when under attack, the United States Supreme Court does not step up.
Yeah, I would like to comment on that if I could. I think I agree wholeheartedly with part of the implicit message in Professor Bogami's question. In my talk yesterday, I started the first value I think that terrorism threatens is our sense of personhood. It's in your face. It's a threat, in Martha Nussbaum's words, to our masculinity of both genders, I guess. It's somehow a challenge to our personhood to say that your government can't secure your safety. Is then also a challenge to the legitimacy of government. I don't know that fear has much to do with it at all. It's really about threatening to our value structures that terrorism confronts.
Hi. We have heard a lot about hearts and minds the last couple of days and sort of the missed opportunities that we haven't done much with. So I was interested today with Professor Sen when he spoke of the connection between poverty and violence. So my question is, there's been a theory that if the U.S. were able to be a real leader in terms of the fight against global AIDS and poverty, specifically in Africa and many of the nations where there could be terrorism hotbeds, how do you feel about that theory? Is that wishful thinking that we could maybe turn the hearts and the minds of the younger generation? And I was also interested when Professor Hoffman mentioned that we're almost past the point where we can affect the next generation, but that we need to look at the generation after that, specifically in light of the millions and millions of children that will be AIDS orphans in the next number of years and that are already AIDS orphans. Is that wishful thinking? Is there something that we could specifically do? And then also, in a general sense, how can we be so bad at our PR? What could we do to really get out there and shed some light on what we are doing for the world and maybe turn our leaders around to try to do more? That's my question.
Okay. Yeah, I want to say two things. One of the major problems of the U.S. handling of this matter is this focus on changing the image of the policy rather than changing the policy. And I think this is time to not to do it under the gun, but to reflect on it and to have experts who would do what is feasible and in what sequence and whatever it is. But obviously there is something fundamentally problematic in that is there, and it is perceived as such. If it's not, it's problematic by itself, then it's not going to pose a problem, but it is widely perceived as such, and if that is the case, then we should focus more not on selecting a superior PR person who has access to the president on a regular basis, but something that goes beyond that to policy. The other thing that I agree with the question raised is that I believe, not only from the case of Egypt, but the case of a number of countries in that part of the world, that a ticking bomb is this unemployed, educated university graduates who are continue to be unemployed for a very long time, and you could see with their own eyes the sons and daughters of upper classes getting employment at the Bank of America and Citibank and all of that for in dollars, and all of that, while they are waiting for, after 16 years of education, there is nothing that is there. My time, which is a very long time ago in Egypt, was after 10 months, exactly 10 months, a piece of paper arrives from the government offering a job. The pay is lousy, and the job may be totally unrelated to anything you have studied, but these are minor details. But there is an element of job security, in there. But now they stay for 8 years or more, and they are in urban centers, which are more politicized, which are and they are listening to media from abroad. It's not like their grandparents who were, quasi-literate or literate and illiterate and so on. They are indignant. They are indignant, articulate, and mobilizable. And that is the kind of thing that you would have a ticking bomb from. So if the United States would lower some of its expenditures in that part of the world on other purposes, and instead devote some attention to those 20% of the population of a certain age group who are not, or 15, or whatever it is, and the problem is general, it's not confined to Egypt, then this may be a useful thing. My task today was to talk about sort of ideas, but ideas also are likely to flourish under certain climates and context. And if the person is, and I promise this is the last thing I'm going to say, but it is this: if the person is suffering from this, and then goes to the mosque, not only the mosque, any other place, and then somebody would say to him, something, you have been suffering from this and that, do you think the Prophet Muhammad would have sanctioned that? The answer, of course, is no, because there is a focus on justice and all of that in that aspect of it. This is a very explosive issue that should be given attention instead of focusing on the public relations aspect of the American policy.
In a similar vein, I will mention once again the D lecture series on global justice, poverty, and war. It's right to share the wealth, not because of what we expect to get out of it, because that's what our values are. We will always have poverty, but our values are to try and bring the world up along with ourselves, with everyone else. That's who we are. Those are our values.
Can I just say one thing?
Absolutely. I'm not trying to have the panel live in fear of me and giving you a mean look. I want you to talk. That's why these people came, for you to give your ideas.
I mean, all these things are good things to do. Resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is an inherent good. Fighting against AIDS, combating poverty, but I think all there's good, and we derive satisfaction. They're important to do. But in terms of terrorism, and Martha, you can agree or disagree, but I have a feeling we'll agree on this, because we've both been to the same conferences over the past 25 years ago that have always been asking the question for a quarter of a century: why do people become terrorism? What are the root causes? I've yet to hear a satisfactory answer, and that's because there isn't any one answer. That's because we're talking about human beings. And individual humans are moved first to activism, then to radicalization, and then to violence due to, I think, entirely personal, entirely idiosyncratic, entirely environmental issues. There isn't one general cause of terrorism. So therefore, all these things that may sound appealing and that may end terrorism aren't going to. I'm not saying that they're necessarily bad. I would go back to my point yesterday, is that we need to avoid both generalizations and avoid conjecture. Let's just look at a very small demographic. The 4 bombers responsible for the July 7th, 2005 attacks in London. 2 of them were university graduates. 2 of them were married with children. 1 of them was a jailbird. Another one was a drug dealer. I mean, right there with those 4, you've got an entire demographic. 1 of them, in fact, was the son of the wealthiest person in the particular community that they lived in. There isn't any one profile. What we find, for instance, in profiles of jihadis in Pakistan is that, contrary to what we want to believe, that if we go in and fix the madrasas, if we put more money into more liberal forms of education, terrorism will end. Studies by Peter Berg and by Mark Sageman have shown that they're not from the madrasas. They're not from the lower socioeconomic rungs. They're people from, as terrorists have been a continuity throughout the centuries, bourgeois or middle class or upper middle class backgrounds, often educated, in many cases gainfully employed. That's not to say that doing all these things isn't going to have an impact against terrorism, but I think it is, what it is to say is that we shouldn't be lulled into believing that there's some universal solution or some magic bullet that we can find and diagnose. And just let me say one other thing. A little bit of the tenor of the conversation today is sort of said, violence is the cause of all this, and violence begets violence. There's some truth to that, but let's face it. I mean, the violence that terrorists inflict are heinous, whether it's just, in their view, it's always justified, and they go through a rather detailed psychological process, that they see themselves as on the defensive, that they see themselves as not having any choice. The violence is, any violence that's directed against innocent civilians, whether by militaries or by terrorists, is equally not just lamentable, but unacceptable. I think there's a key difference, at least in the laws of war, and at least in military codes of conduct. Violence is not wantonly inflicted on civilians. It's not to say there aren't collateral casualties that are tragic, but it is not the objective. It is not the raison d'etre. It's not the purpose of military action to kill civilians. On the other hand, that is exactly the purpose of terrorism. And consequently, I think, to really be effective in stopping terrorism, I mean, it does involve military force. We have to kill them, or we have to capture them. We have to break their backs. That there's no doubt. Terrorists are not going to negotiate. They are not going to relinquish their aims unless they are weakened. But what we need are smart strategies that uses violence, that recognizes reluctantly we may have to use violence against those who mean us harm, but that simultaneously have an array of smart approaches that seek to isolate the radicals and therefore prevent the ranks of the terrorist ranks from swelling, and strengthening the voices of moderation. So my point would be, it's not enough to rely on violence, and perhaps in recent years we have deluded ourselves that that could be a solution, but that goes back to my first point. There is no one solution. But equally, we can't assume that violence in appropriate circumstances is not absolutely necessary.
Any other comments from the panel? Okay. Take a question. Hopefully this is working now.
I'd just like to press Bruce a little bit, because I thought there was a little hint of inconsistency there. Perish the thought. That is, on the one hand, as you were disparaging, not unreasonably, I add, these solutions of reduce poverty, solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and so on. You said, after all, terrorism is the decision to move to violence is an idiosyncratic one. But then, just a moment ago, you were talking about the need to limit the pool of potential adherents. So you are suggesting that issues, the environment, the political environment, do play a role, that its idiosyncrasy may move someone from alienation to actual participation in the violence. But yeah, I'm sure you didn't mean to suggest that these larger issues do not affect the ability of radical movements to enlarge themselves. So that's one point. Could I ask one more very... This is also relevant.
Why do you hate me?
The question, this is really the difficult question about the moral economy of terrorism. Let's take the South African case. Mandela dies, or he lives, but de Klerk proposes negotiations and he is expelled from the cabinet. and it turns out that the hardline faction among the Afrikaners wins. What? And then you are an advisor to the African National, and 10 years goes by, let's say. Population of blacks continues to grow, apartheid is the same, the conditions of, now it's 50 million people decline. You're an advisor to the African National Congress, and they said, we've tried everything. Obviously, passive resistance doesn't work. We tried to organize it. They kill us. They torture us, and so on. And the U.S. and the rest of the world isn't imposing serious enough sanctions. What are our alternatives? Well, and I'm just not just looking at you, Bruce, but I really it's the whole panel. Are there cases where you have alien domination, or majority domination of minority, in this case minority domination of a majority, where you've tried passive resistance, but it didn't work. You've tried everything you could think of, but it hasn't worked, and the outside world doesn't care enough, for one reason or another, to put its thumb on the scale to re-equilibrate the power relationships. What do you say then as advisor to the African National Congress? Do you still say, the one thing you can't do is attack soft targets? That you can't do? And if you have to live with domination, you live with it, because if you believe in human rights, you cannot use people as instruments. That seems to me the real dilemma. It doesn't happen very often, but it can happen in a given case.
Well, Tom, just take that same thought and continue it on. You can't target the soft targets, the civilian population. You can target the governmental installations, the police, the military. They are the instruments of oppression. But if you lose, you lose. You are breaking the law. And it just has to be faced in that setting, that you are putting yourself at risk when you go up against the government forces. No? But no, I answered your moral issue. Morally, you still cannot attack the civilian. Right. No, I thought that we agreed on that to begin with. But you do still have a course of action.
Other people willing to jump in here?
Since Tom addressed the question to me, I think with respect to your first question, there's just a difference of nuance and perhaps emphasis. My only point is that, and I perhaps wasn't clear about that, curing poverty or solving poverty is not going to stop terrorism. It will, though, and I agree completely, it will be a significant contribution in draining the potential pool of recruits that terrorists might seek to recruit. It will limit their power, and it will take what may be a neutral, which may be a side that's particularly susceptible to the terrorist entreaties, and hopefully prevent them from drifting into terrorism into the side. So I agree with you completely. So it's really just a nuance. What I object to is people who seize on one issue and say, reforming the madrasas, we're going to solve terrorism. Resolve the Palestinian-Israeli problem, terrorism is going to end. All those things are good in their own right. They're certainly going to help. They certainly will, and that's my idea. Isolate the radicals and strengthen the moderates and build moderation, so absolutely. Second point, well, the one thing, I mean, Nelson Mandela is admirable on any number of different levels, but what I think makes him most admirable in this context is when you read Long Walk to Freedom. And unlike the other apologists for their violence or sycophants or rhetorical gymnasts, I mean, he makes exactly this point in the early 1960s, that they felt that they had exhausted all other remedies, all other venues, and that very reluctantly he thought the only course was to turn to terrorism, and cites, in fact, the Algerians and the FLN as the model. There's two issues. Firstly, at least he is admitting in what he's doing. I mean, that's part of the key. He says, I am turning to this form of violence. Now, it's very rare amongst terrorist leaders that they will actually say that. In fact, most leaders, well, not many write memoirs, but those who do, go out of their way to avoid ever saying that and get into these very complex. He made a moral decision, and that's I think, that's the crux. But I think Wayne's point is I think, the correct one. There are, I think, ways to wage these struggles that don't involve the wanton, as opposed to perhaps the collateral deaths of civilians. And we see over the past decades, I mean, terrorism today, I would argue, is very different than it was in the early 1960s or a century ago. When Martha described earlier the terrorists of the late 19th century, the people's will in Tsarist Russia, would not countenance the shedding of innocent blood. On one opportunity when they, I think it was the Grand Duke, who they planned to kill, when he showed up that morning with his children in the carriage, they didn't kill him. We know patently terrorists do not live, at least most of them, there may be some, but most of them do not live under that same code of terrorism, chivalry as it once existed, has become antiquated, and terrorists do now engage fundamentally in different forms of even, Mandela at least also, even if he may have reluctantly embraced terrorism, but it was still a far more constrained and deliberate form of violence, a calculated form. All terrorism is calculated, but a more discrete form of violence than unfortunately we suffer from today.
Anybody else? Marilyn, I've seen your hand waving.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Actually, and I do want to continue the topic, so it's partly addressed to Bruce. Here is the way I see problems with military counterterrorism these days. As we've agreed, and as you pointed out, the laws of war allow one to attack combatants. They do not allow the intentional targeting of non-combatants, but they allow a number of deaths of non-combatants that's foreseen but not intended. It's collateral damage. I said in different words, I think the same kind of thing you were saying. When when lots of countries go after the terrorists, most terrorists live among a population that is sympathetic to them and harbors them. And so we indirectly, we then send in the military, we drop bombs. It's true that our intention is to kill the terrorists and not to kill the civilians who happen to live in the same neighborhood. But we kill. The Israelis kill. Other countries doing this kill a lot of civilians as we are attacking the terrorists. We say, well, we didn't really mean to kill the civilians. We're sorry about it. We regret it. Think of how many times we've said that in Iraq. But that's not the way it's perceived. It's perceived by those people and by the terrorists as we trying to fight terrorism, fighting terrorism by ourselves, using terrorism. It might be an intentional misreading of us, but it's very easy to be perceived that way. As a result, the terrorists feel like, and the population they live among feel like, we who are fighting terrorism are terrorists themselves, and that just makes everything worse. So I'd like you, Bruce, or anyone else to comment on that.
May I ask you a question? I mean, to reverse it, the questions should go in various directions. What is your assessment of the option of doing nothing? Because things should be put in some perspective. I mean, so there are limitations. I mean, if terrorists know that that the American government or whatever government under discussion will be eternally constrained by, a public opinion or a group of intellectuals who would insist that any military action is a taboo. Wouldn't that, what kind of message does it send? Is the option of doing nothing better? The United Nations.
I'll just say very quickly, I don't have a good answer, but I suppose the answer is doing something smarter. And I don't know. What does that mean? I don't know what it is.
What does that mean?
Well, it does seem to me that if we persist in attacking the terrorists in the way that we do, we just make the situation continually worse. And I should hope there are smarter ways to get them that don't involve killing all these innocent people to make us look like terrorists ourselves. But I'm not the expert on terrorism. You guys.
Wait.
I think we should let them speak.
And then we'll have terrorism. I think when we talk about operational counterterrorism, we need to be really careful in hyperbole. So I don't know what it means when we say we're killing all of these innocent people. It's important to note a couple of things. First of all, international law is very clear in delineating four important principles. One is proportionality, the other is alternatives, the third is military necessity, and the fourth is collateral damage. Hang on. Collateral damage is critical here. It is inevitable, all but inevitable, when you conduct aggressive counterterrorism, that innocent civilians are going to die. It's tragic, but it's true. But before we say that all of these innocent civilians are dying, we also have to ask ourselves, why are there innocent civilians there? In X percentage of the cases, and I don't know the numbers, it's clear that some of these people have been placed in a position of human shielding. Human shielding is when the terrorists surround themselves deliberately with innocent people, some of whom are there of their own free will and volition. It is tragic that they're going to die, but on the other hand, the case in Gaza this past summer, there were Palestinian women came there willingly to be human shields outside the mosque. So it's inevitable that's going to happen. You try to minimize it, but you have to understand that when you conduct operational counterterrorism, that's a reality. There's no doubt that mistakes happen. I'm not here to excuse or justify mistakes, but it's a reality. On the other hand, I don't think any nation state can sit passively by and say, kumbaya, all will be well. It does not work like that.
Bruce asked the question, can't we do it in a smarter way? And I would like to tell you, yes, we can, and what that could be. The point is that let's not talk about the Iraq War as a war of counter terrorism or war against terror, because attacking Iraq in response to 9/11 is like attacking Mexico in response to Pearl Harbor. So let's talk about. So that's not very smart there. Okay. What about Afghanistan, where the terrorists came from? Well, the terrorists were hiding there within a nation state, a failed state perhaps, but nonetheless a nation state, and we declared war. And the point some of us we have been making is that the war model is not the effective model, nor perhaps a moral model, And Ibrahim asked a question that I thought was either or sort of a question. What else can I do, as if the options are simply to go for all-out war, regardless of the consequence, meaning the extent of collateral damage, or not do anything. It doesn't have to be either of these two extremes. It could be other ways. For example, we could have had a surgical operation in Afghanistan, or a sort of a police type of an operation than a war operation. And the idea is that we condemn the terrorists for their very perverse idea of a notion of collective liability, that just because they have been wronged in so many ways, at least that's the perception, therefore everybody is guilty in this country and surely in the World Trade Center and all that. That's perverse, that idea of collective liability. But by going to Afghanistan, putting all the Talibans to task, either to kill them or to capture them, when most of the Talibans, as reprehensible as they may be in their belief and ideas and religion, they didn't have anything to do with that. They couldn't have cared less about that. It's their leadership maybe that joined hands with some of the leaders of the terrorist leaders, and to rout them out. That's also a very perverse, wrong notion of collective liability, and we have to take responsibility for that. So the smart way in Afghanistan is not the way that we have gone, and surely it shows that it's not very smart, it's not helping in fighting terrorism, to go in a different way, collaborative way, with international diplomacy and bring other countries back in there. In fact, then to see if those terrorists could have been handed over to some sort of international court of justice or something like that. We didn't go that way. We have been way too much into responding militarily, and we didn't give negotiation much of a chance. So there are surely smarter ways to go about it. It doesn't have to be either not doing anything or to go in a gung-ho way regardless of the consequences vis-a-vis collateral damage.
If I could just say one thing, I think Afghanistan and Iraq are two separate issues, and with all due respect, I think that many Afghans would disagree with you profoundly. I think unlike Iraq, the majority of Afghans not only want the United States and coalition forces to remain there and to stabilize and pacify their country, also to protect them from predators across the border. But indeed, they want more troops, and they want more of a commitment. So I think Afghanistan is a very different issue, and we risk mixing apples and oranges and comparing that to Iraq.
All right, it is, I'm sorry, Wayne?
No, go ahead.
Okay. It's getting close to 5 o'clock, but since we started late, I'm certainly willing, and if people are, we'll continue going on here.
Thank you. This changes gears a little bit. This is a question for Amos Guiora. Did I pronounce that correctly? I'd like to hear more about the hybrid model for dealing with people who are captured and detained and accused of being terrorists. You said you would give them some rights but not all, so I'd like to know which rights would you withhold and why, and in light of the following thought, I'm not sure that the POW model is useful at all. Prisoners of war are not supposed to be tortured. They're not supposed to be detained indefinitely. Now, they're supposed to be released when the war is over, and this war may never end. That's a problem. But I'm not sure the POW model is very helpful here at all. And one of the things that I think is so important about the criminal law model is that somebody is innocent until proven guilty, at least under our system of criminal law. And so I can't stand the expression suspected terrorists as if this were some kind of terrorist, which is used all the time in the media. So individuals who are detained and accused of being terrorists, why should any of their rights under criminal law be suspended? What reasons would you give?
3 questions, I won't have to remember this, okay? The theory I've proposed in an article I wrote is about the hybrid model. In the traditional judicial context, there's either a criminal law model, which we all know from Law and Order, Miami Vice, all those other TV shows, and the other one is the POW paradigm, where you're absolutely right, you have to be returned at the end of the hostilities, you can't be tried unless you committed a crime against war crime, or if you commit a crime while in detention. That model, I agree with you 100%, is not applicable to this because these guys are not soldiers. So that's inapplicable. The criminal law model is almost perfect for our purposes with a couple of exceptions. One, to introduce evidence in a criminal proceeding, as we know through TV, the defendant has the right to confront his accuser. Much of counterterrorism is based on intelligence. Intelligence largely comes from 3 sources. One is SIGINT, which is signal intelligence. The other one is open sources. The third is human intelligence. If a source is brought to court to testify openly, this we know obviously in the Palestinian context, most sources who are outed are killed. The state has an obligation to protect the source. In the hybrid model I've developed, here's the way it works. The defendant, well, first of all, the suspect, will be brought before a judge as if in the criminal law process. There will be no indefinite detention. Interrogation will be based on coercive interrogation and not on torture. Torture is immoral, illegal, and doesn't lead to actionable intelligence. He will be brought before a judge, meaning there's an independent judicial review. He will be in detention, will be given the right to remain silent, even though he's not an American citizen. The trial itself will be conducted by bench trial, not by jury, for 2 reasons. I think, first of all, I think in most cases, jurors have great difficulty understanding intelligence information. I think there's also a danger that jurors will be threatened by these guys and their families. So it'll be a bench trial based on the American criminal law procedure, without the right to confront all of their accusers. But conviction cannot be based solely on the information that he can't confront. It can assist the judge in making the conviction decision or the acquittal decision, meaning it's an assister. It's not the sole basis for conviction. Appeal will be made to the United States Supreme Court. I've suggested that the FISA court be turned into a trial court. FISA court is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which today enables the government to come before the court to ask for warrants for wiretapping. I would turn that into a bench court, enabling the trial of individuals suspected of having committed terrorism-related crimes. So, for instance, Moussaoui would not have been brought before the United States District Court. This would also require, in essence, doing away with Guantanamo. It would require an almost Article 3 related criminal trial for these guys, minus a few rights. So it's criminal law minus, and I think in terms of protecting on the one hand the state interest, on the other hand also the rights of the detainee, as far as I can tell, at least suggest a model that, as I know, has led to a great deal of discussion as to its applicability. I think it does a fairly good job of protecting the rights of the detainee, who, you're absolutely right, is innocent until otherwise.
May I just comment, this is one where Amos and I will agree to disagree. I would keep that defendant in mind, as the 500 years of Anglo-American jurisprudence says we should, as a person who is innocent until proven guilty by normal procedures. If you're not willing to bring your informant out, then you try to turn that suspect and make that suspect into an informant. That's your first step. Your next step is leave that person in place with monitoring, and it's expensive. It's a lot of money to track their movements. But eventually, if your informant is good and this person is doing something, you're going to get evidence that can stand alone without the informant.
Not getting into tick for tack here, but it's a twofold process here, a two-tier process. One is the absolute requirement to try to give a defendant as much rights as possible. Where I think we disagree is how we best protect the source and how best to utilize the source. That is an issue we need to discuss at length, because that really is, as we go forward here, we want to talk about how we go forward. One of the most important legal questions as we go forward with all this is how do we protect the source, how do we use the source, and how do we make the criminal law process far more applicable to this new paradigm.
I've been told 3 more questions, and so I've been on this side for quite some time, so let me go this side.
This has been a wonderful exploration of all the complexities, but I'm trying to, from the panel, trying to get some sort of a sense of an overarching view. And the closest I can come to it takes us back to the opening session of Tom Ferrer's Toward a Liberal Grand Strategy, which I think would cut across a lot of what you're saying. And I guess I would just be interested to know where you would differ from that. So obviously, war on terror is not really working. But should we all march out here and under the banner of a Toward a Liberal Grand Strategy, or where would you differ from that?
You could do a lot worse than to march out following Tom Ferrer. Well, there's a lot of diversity of view in that liberal grand strategy, of course, and I only would comment that my notion of a plea for modernizing or moving forward on a global political theory stems right out of that same point. Finding ways to encompass all of the diverse cultures that need to be brought into a single umbrella is a real challenge for political theory, in my view. And it's a challenge particularly among those identity groups that don't recognize church and state separation, because there you have a real difficult time of figuring out how to put together a republic. But that's our task, is to keep the diversity but have a coherent political structure within it.
Just if I may, one word. One of the most troubling recommendations of the Iraq Study Group was a recommendation to the president that he speak the truth to the American public. Now, we can all chuckle, but I think that's extraordinarily disturbing that the Iraq Study Group felt the need to tell the president to speak the truth. Because as we go forward here, we really are, I think, as a nation, absolutely required to stop spinning. And that bluster of bring them on, it doesn't work. And we need to, in many ways, reassess where we are in terms of international law, where we are in terms of domestic law, and how we go forward, back to your question, of how we go forward in terms of trying to, on the one hand, protect ourselves, and on the other hand, protect those who we think maybe are attacking us. And that's going to require America or Americans to look at themselves very honestly. As you think about the presidential election in 2008, you can see an enormous amount of spin, which frankly does all of us a great disservice.
I'm on this side, so good to...
I'm sorry, I've been very persistent. My name is Carol Curtis, and I'm just from the community. And I'm certainly not in academia, and this is in some ways a new experience for me, having been out of the country for most of the last 30 years in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So my perspective is maybe a little bit different. But what I would like to bring forward is the thoughts of a different type of paradigm, and back a little bit to the idea of identity, that maybe our identity is that we are members of the humanity on this planet, and that maybe there is a common ground. We know there is a common ground. Now, you've alluded to this a little bit in a couple of sentences here and there, but I've been waiting for something like this all weekend, or all the past 2 days, that yes, we have terrorism. We don't know the solutions. We can talk about it. We need to talk about it, but in some ways we're going around in circles. In 50 years, are we going to be talking about the same thing? In 100 years, are we going to be talking about the same thing? If we don't shift our focus in our minds to a broader perspective and put this into our educational systems, I think we're going to continue going around in circles to some extent. And my premise is that we are one people on this planet. We are all, this earth is but one country, and we are its citizens. That doesn't mean that solves the problems, but it forces us to shift possibly our thinking, to shift our emphasis. We have been looking at the divisions, we have been looking at divisiveness, we have been looking at hatreds, we have been looking at pretty much negative manifestations on this planet right now. What are the positive things? What are the positive things we can focus on? What is our common ground? How do we create unity in diversity? We in this room here are coming from various different countries and backgrounds, but we get along fine in this room. Why? What is our premise that is different than maybe other people in other places on this planet? And I don't think we've addressed that. And I don't know how we can deal with the issues of the world today without looking at the bigger picture of the oneness of humanity. And that we have common needs, we have common pains. We are the same. If we have a child and we see a child in pain, we all feel the same. There is no difference, whether you're a terrorist or whether you're a mother with a newborn. If we are looking at what we are as moral, ethical, and potentially very, very spiritual beings. And I'm sorry, but I just think that this is the only way that we can begin really, really focusing on a shift in our approach, a shift in our way of thinking about things on this planet and the issues on this planet. And maybe the global warming and the global climate change is what is going to force us as humanity, as the wholeness of humanity on this planet, to really come together. And when we're looking at problems, not looking at it from the standpoint of the United States, not looking at the standpoint of myself, but looking at it from the standpoint of what is the best that we can come up with as possible solutions or ideas or approaches for every human being on this planet. And this may sound very idealistic and naive, but I still think it is a premise that we need to have in our minds, and we need to teach our children, and we need to talk about at all levels of society.
Ibrahim?
I do share very much your concern and worries about what the current perspectives produce, and I would suggest that Deen would fund another conference for that topic.
And I would only comment that there is no just from the community. That's part of our community. And thank you.
I know, but
Well, we hope we're all part of the same community is the point.
Any other comments to that?
If we shifted from thinking about terrorism as an act of war as a crime, and then we think about crime in America, and there's been crime and it's a continuing, ongoing process of how to deal with crime. If we made that shift to terrorism, this is a crime, we need to pursue the criminal, would that not improve the overall level of well-being of the people in the world.
Well, I've been pitching that for the last couple of days here, and I would have to admit, obviously, that it's not a complete answer on terrorism for a couple of reasons. We've never completely eliminated crime, as hard as we try, right? We're still going to have crime. We will have terrorism. The other part of the answer that I have to admit is that we do not at the moment have a global suprastate enforcement mechanism that will take care of the crime of terrorism. So it's got to be done by cooperative individual sovereignties at the moment. And that is very, very difficult, which means to me there will still be some occasion for military action. And as several people here have pointed out, that does not mean war. There's a concept called military operations other than war, or in Amos's terms, armed conflict short of war. Either of those terminologies means, yes, you do sometimes call on the military to bring force to bear so that your criminal processes are more effective. But it is not war.
All right, in a bit of an attempt to wrap things up here, I'd like to go back to the panel as we started with the panel, and starting again with Deen, if there are some concluding comments that you would like to make. I know everyone feels dissatisfied that we haven't come up with the magic bullet, but you know, if it were easy, others would have done it already. But I think we could benefit from just a couple of closing comments, maybe your best idea that you have to resolve this.
I don't want to take up any more time. I have benefited from these comments, so I would simply like to make my old point, which is that perhaps violence is not the best way to deal with violence, and there should be some other ways we try to explore our options. And I think that cooperation, diplomacy, as ingrained in our foreign policy, which we don't have right now at this point, should be the way to go. So instead of this Jacksonian model, I would like to go back to the Wilsonian model that served us so well during the times of crisis in the past. Why can't we do it now?
I think the fact that this conference was organized in such an extraordinarily interdisciplinary fashion is, from my perspective, is what I take away from this. Because I think if we go, as we go forward and better trying to understand terrorism and trying to develop better counterterrorism practices, it's going to require individuals from different disciplines to think together how to do this. It's going to require linguists. It's going to require anthropologists. It's going to require psychologists. It's going to require, unfortunately, lawyers. It's going to require political scientists. It's going to require the public. The only way we can try to somehow understand both terrorism and counterterrorism is in this truly multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary fashion. And I turn to my gracious hosts and thank you. This was truly extraordinary.
In my presentations, I've actually talked about some different ways of viewing the problem as a global counterinsurgency rather than the war on terrorism. So I won't repeat those. What I would say is that we're talking about a phenomena that is enormously dynamic and evolutionary, and that is constantly changing, as indeed the approaches that terrorism have to change and constantly adjust. And I think, on the one hand, what worked yesterday is unlikely to work tomorrow, so we have to adjust our countermeasures. At the same time, though, we have to constantly be questioning whether our conduct of this campaign is whether it's being done along lines that we're comfortable with, that conform to our values, and that we have to keep asking the questions and searching for the answers.
Two quick things. One is that revisiting the past to identify models and things to learn from it is very useful, and I'm very much in agreement with Deen about that. But even models that have been associated with cooperation and so on had their own exceptions. And even in Wilsonian models, the war to end all wars was not something to apologize for in any significant way on the part of the those who pursued it. But on the contrary, war could be pursued with greater vigor by those who think that they have established their credentials in terms of seeking peace and so on. So the other thing is that I think really that in the midst of all this, the most important thing for me is a personal sense of gratitude for the organizers of this conference for producing a marvelous effort intellectually and personally, and I'm beginning to get sentimental about the end of this thing, so I hope you forgive me if I started crying or something.
I think this one works. Well, I agree. It's been a stimulating 2 days of discussions, and lots of ideas have come up, and I think the best thing we can come away with is that there's just no one big answer for how to deal with this, and this is one way that the administration got itself into trouble, was trying to come up with one big simplifying idea about what terrorism was, a bunch of totalitarians who want to take over the world, refusing to see the complex, nuanced reality of it, blindly refusing to see, and then thinking there could be one big answer to such a multifaceted problem. I think we all need to turn our attention to what's going to happen once we've withdrawn from Iraq and what kind of world we're going to be living in, say, 2 years from now with a new administration, that everyone should inform themselves as much as they can about these problems and weigh in on the public debate. We have not had enough of a public debate over what we should do in the counterterrorism realm.
Well, I hate to close on just a note of me too, but I'm likewise very impressed and stimulated and almost somewhat emotional about the 2 days. To thank all the presenters for coming here, as well as all the members of the various communities who have come in and shared thoughts and ideas and commitment, I think, to a peaceful resolution of our world problems is just a tremendous thing. So thank you.
And I was just going to offer that up for everyone. I know some of you didn't get to ask your questions, but the panel is not going to flee immediately. You have some of the world's leading experts here. This is, if you want to come up and talk to them, not just the panel, but Tom is here, Meryl. There are a number of people, and please interact with them. I don't think the bar opens till 7, so they will be here for a while. Thank you all for coming, and I hope it was worth your time and effort.